History remembers the Han Dynasty as a golden age of stability, but in the year 9 AD, a single man performed a total hostile takeover of the Chinese state to launch the world's first total command economy. Wang Mang was not a traditional usurper. He was a radical central planner who viewed the empire as a malfunctioning machine in need of a violent factory reset. He believed that the state could optimize every single grain of rice and every hour of labor through the sheer force of imperial decree. By nationalizing the soil and abolishing private property, he did not just target the wealthy. He deleted the very software of the market. This was a forensic audit of a civilization conducted by an emperor who acted as the CEO of a nation-sized monopoly. But as he replaced high-purity gold with tortoise shells and cowries, the empire realized that you cannot legislate prosperity into existence. The math was absolute, the execution was brutal, and the resulting liquidity trap was about to turn the world's most powerful economy into a terminal bankruptcy. Before the currency could collapse, however, Wang Mang had to seize the ultimate asset, the very ground beneath the people's feet. To understand this hostile takeover, one must analyze the balance sheet of the late Han Dynasty, where land served as the primary store of value and the foundation of social hierarchy. For centuries, a class of powerful families had consolidated vast estates, creating a decentralized network of wealth that operated outside the direct control of the central treasury. Wang Mang viewed this private accumulation as a systemic inefficiency that drained the imperial coffers and weakened the state's leverage over its subjects. He did not just intend to tax these estates. He aimed to liquidate the concept of private land ownership entirely through a radical policy of nationalization. By invoking an idealized, ancient system of communal farming, he prepared to execute the largest asset seizure in human history. This was not a populist reform, but a calculated move to turn every farmer into a state-contracted laborer. However, the logistical friction of remapping an entire subcontinent was a cost the new emperor had failed to calculate. The mechanics of this nationalization were centered on the Jing-tian, or well-field system, a theoretical model that the emperor attempted to impose on a complex, living economy. Under this decree, all land was renamed the emperor's land, and the buying or selling of acreage was strictly prohibited under penalty of death. A square of land was divided into 9 equal plots, where 8 families worked the outer sections for their own subsistence, while the central plot was farmed exclusively for the state. This was the birth of the administrative state as a landlord, a move that effectively nationalized the means of production for millions. Wang Mang argued that this would end rural poverty and eliminate the predatory lending practices of the landed gentry. In reality, it was a massive expansion of the imperial tax base designed to fund an ever-growing bureaucracy. By outlawing the sale of land, the emperor froze the real estate market and destroyed the primary collateral used for credit. This sudden lack of liquidity meant that even the most productive farmers were now staring down the barrel of a state-mandated famine because they could no longer borrow against their assets. The enforcement of these reforms required an army of bureaucrats who were more interested in hitting administrative quotas than in the actual output of the soil. Local officials were granted the power to seize any plot that was not being utilized according to the new, rigid imperial standards. This created a perverse incentive structure where neighbors reported neighbors to avoid being seen as complicit in underutilization or hoarding. The social fabric of the countryside, once built on generational land ownership, was shredded in favor of a top-down hierarchy. Wang Mang believed that by controlling the land, he could control the people, turning the entire population into a predictable variable in his economic equations. He was building a machine that required perfect data, yet the information coming from the provinces was increasingly distorted by fear and corruption. As the agrarian economy began to stall, the emperor doubled down on his centralized vision, refusing to acknowledge the mounting friction in the fields. The abolition of private land ownership had not created a utopia. It had created a massive administrative bottleneck that prevented resources from reaching the areas where they were needed most. Without the ability to sell land, families were trapped on unproductive plots, unable to migrate toward better opportunities. The state's inability to manage the logistics of millions of small farms led to a catastrophic decline in total output. Wang Mang responded by increasing the penalties for non-compliance, further alienating the very people he claimed to be saving. He had successfully seized the soil, but he had failed to realize that by nationalizing the land, he had also seized the responsibility for every future crop failure and every starving mouth in the empire. This agricultural collapse was only the first stage of the liquidation, as the emperor now turned his forensic gaze toward the very concept of money itself. With the land nationalized, Wang Mang turned his attention to the medium of exchange, initiating a series of currency reforms that would make a modern central banker as headspin. He understood that as long as the people held high-purity gold and silver, they maintained a degree of economic autonomy from the central state. To break this independence, he introduced a dizzying array of 28 different denominations, including coins, spade-shaped tokens, and even tortoise shells. This was not a move to facilitate trade, but a deliberate complexity tax designed to confuse the public and devalue their existing savings. By mandating the use of these low intrinsic value tokens, the state was effectively performing a forced conversion of private wealth into state-controlled script. The empire's gold did not disappear. It was being systematically vacuumed into the imperial treasury through a massive state-sponsored raid. This was seigniorage taken to its most logical and most destructive extreme. The new currency system was a logistical nightmare that paralyzed the very markets it was supposed to stimulate through increased circulation. Merchants found it impossible to price goods when a legal tender could change at the whim of an imperial decree or a new minting cycle. A single transaction might require the calculation of exchange rates between copper knives, spade coins, and various grades of seashells. This friction acted as a massive drag on the velocity of money, causing the economy to grind to a halt in the major trading hubs. People began to hoard the old Han coins, creating a black market that operated in direct defiance of the new imperial law. Wang Mang responded not by simplifying the system, but by increasing the brutality of the penalties for those who refused to use his new money. He was attempting to use state violence to prop up a currency that lacked any form of market confidence. This state-sponsored gold raid was perhaps the most audacious part of his entire economic experiment, targeting the liquidity of the entire nation. All gold held by the nobility and the merchant class was ordered to be surrendered to the state in exchange for the new, debased currency at a fraction of its true value. This move effectively liquidated the capital of the upper and middle classes, leaving them with bags of worthless shells and low-grade copper. The emperor believed that by centralizing the gold supply, he could fund his ambitious social programs and military campaigns without the need for traditional taxation. What he failed to realize was that he was destroying the very concept of a store of value within his borders. Without a stable currency, long-term investment became impossible, and the empire's internal credit rating effectively collapsed. The state was now the only entity with any recognizable wealth, but that wealth was tied up in a metal that no one was allowed to trade. The chaos in the markets led to a total breakdown of the price signal, making it impossible for the central planners to allocate resources efficiently. Wang Mang tried to fix this by implementing strict price controls and state-mandated market days, but this only led to widespread shortages and the disappearance of basic necessities. The emperor's obsession with ancient ritual meant that he prioritized the aesthetic and symbolic value of his coins over their utility as a medium of exchange. Some of the new denominations were so fragile or cumbersome that they could not even be carried for long distances without breaking or causing physical strain. This was not just a failure of monetary policy. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of how human beings value their labor and their time. As the economy withered, the emperor remained convinced that the problem was not his math, but the people's lack of Confucian virtue. He was about to learn that no amount of imperial moralizing could fill an empty stomach or stop the inevitable rise of a hungry army. The final blow to the monetary system came when the state began to run out of the raw materials needed to produce the 28 denominations. The complexity of the system had created an administrative overhead that consumed more resources than the currency itself was worth in the open market. Counterfeiting became a national pastime, as the low quality of the official coins made them easy to replicate in illegal backyard mints. The government's response was to execute entire families for the crime of illegal minting, yet the flood of fake money continued to drown the official economy. This hyperinflationary environment destroyed the last vestiges of public trust in the Han Dynasty and its radical leader. Wang Mang had successfully seized the gold, but in doing so, he had killed the very engine of commerce that produced it. The economic software of the nation was corrupted beyond repair, and as the gold reserves sat cold in the imperial vaults, the first tremors of a violent market correction were beginning to shake the very foundations of the throne. But Wang Mang was not finished with his factory reset. He believed that if the money failed, it was because the people themselves were not working hard enough for the collective good. He decided that the state should not just own the land and the currency, but every single hour of a citizen's life. This was the birth of the productivity audit, a system designed to squeeze value out of a population that had already been stripped of its assets. The emperor was about to turn the entire empire into a high-pressure workhouse, where even the act of resting was treated as a fiscal crime against the state. This move was not just a policy change. It was a total claim on the biology of the Chinese people. Wang Mang viewed the empire as a massive, underperforming asset that required a firm hand to reach its theoretical maximum output. He believed that the primary cause of the state's fiscal deficit was the inherent laziness of the peasantry and the merchant class. To solve this, he instituted the gong fu, or laziness tax, which functioned as a state-mandated productivity quota for every household in the nation. This was a forensic attempt to quantify the unquantifiable, the value of human effort and the cost of idle time. By assigning a specific tax to those who did not plant trees, weave cloth, or cultivate fields, the emperor transformed the act of living into a debt that had to be repaid to the state. Every citizen was now a line item on an imperial ledger, and their failure to meet the state's expectations was treated as a form of embezzlement. The emperor was convinced that the threat of fiscal ruin would force the population into a state of hyperproductivity. But the state's ability to measure productivity was far inferior to its ability to issue threats. The mechanics of this productivity audit were as complex as they were intrusive, requiring a massive expansion of the administrative state to monitor the output of millions. Local officials were tasked with conducting door-to-door inspections to verify that every loom was moving and every field was being worked to its physical limit. If a household failed to produce the required amount of silk or hemp, they were not just fined, they were forced into a system of state-contracted labor. This effectively turned the entire population into a pool of potential debt slaves who could be liquidated at any time for the crime of inefficiency. The state became the ultimate creditor, and the only currency that mattered was the sweat of the laborer. This system ignored the basic reality of human exhaustion and the diminishing returns of forced work. Wang Mang believed he could legislate a work ethic into existence through the sheer weight of imperial decree. Yet, even as the looms fell silent and the fields grew thin, the imperial reports continued to claim that the productivity of the empire was reaching unprecedented heights. As the quality of production fell, the emperor's focus shifted from the volume of goods to the total control of their distribution and price. This led to the introduction of the 5 equalizations, a policy designed to stabilize the market by turning the state into the empire's largest and only merchant. The theory was that the state would buy surplus goods when prices were low and sell them back to the public when prices were high, effectively eliminating the boom and bust cycles of the market. This was a direct assault on the merchant class, whom Wang Mang viewed as parasites who profited from the price fluctuations of essential goods. By centralizing the price discovery mechanism, the emperor believed he could create a perfectly balanced economy where no one would ever want for bread or salt. In reality, he was deleting the very price signals that allowed the economy to function in the first place. This was a total nationalization of the market's nervous system, leaving the state to guess the value of everything it owned. The destruction of the price signal meant that the emperor and his advisors were now operating in a total information vacuum. Without the natural fluctuations of a free market, there was no way to know where grain was needed or where cloth was in surplus. The 5 equalizations officers who were responsible for setting these prices had no skin in the game and were often easily bribed by local cartels. These bureaucrats would report that prices were stable and the people were satisfied, while the reality on the ground was a cascading series of shortages and gluts. The state was trying to manage a massive economy using data that was weeks old and often intentionally falsified to please the throne. This administrative friction meant that the imperial machine was grinding against itself, generating heat but no forward motion. The emperor was convinced that his math was perfect, even as the ledger began to show signs of a terminal collapse. Beyond the price controls, the state established the 6 monopolies, seizing total control over liquor, salt, iron, coinage, and the products of forests and marshes. This was a move to consolidate every possible revenue stream under the imperial umbrella, leaving no room for private enterprise to breathe. By controlling these essential industries, the state hoped to generate the liquidity needed to fund its massive bureaucracy and its endless military border campaigns. However, the nationalization of these sectors led to a massive drop in efficiency and a surge in the cost of basic goods. Iron tools produced in state-run foundries were often of such poor quality that they broke during the first harvest, yet farmers were forbidden from buying from private smiths. The state was now a monopoly that provided subpar products at inflated, state-mandated prices. This created a massive opportunity cost for the entire nation, as resources were funneled into failing state industries rather than productive private ventures. The reliance on terrified bureaucrats for economic data created an asymmetric information gap that would eventually prove fatal for the Han Dynasty. Local officials knew that reporting a failed harvest or a shortage of iron would result in their immediate dismissal or execution for obstructing the imperial will. Consequently, they sent back glowing reports of record-breaking yields and overflowing granaries, even as the people in their districts began to eat the bark off the trees. Wang Mang sat in his palace, reading these fabricated spreadsheets and believing that his command economy was a resounding success. This was the birth of the Potemkin economy, where the appearance of prosperity was more important than the reality of survival. The emperor was making life and death decisions based on data that was essentially a work of fiction. This lack of feedback meant that the state could not correct its course until it was already too late. The resulting logistics collapse was a direct consequence of this total breakdown in the economy's information software. In one province, grain would be left to rot in state-run silos because the 5 equalizations officers had set the price too high for the local population to afford. Meanwhile, in a neighboring province, thousands were dying of starvation because the bureaucratic paperwork required to release the grain had been lost or delayed. The state-controlled transport networks were clogged with administrative friction, as every cartload of rice had to be audited and stamped by multiple layers of officials. There was no market incentive for merchants to move goods to where they were needed most, as the state had outlawed the very concept of profit. The empire was physically falling apart because its central nervous system could no longer coordinate its own limbs. This was not a failure of resources, but a total failure of the administrative state to manage the resources it had seized. The laziness tax and the 5 equalizations had combined to create a perfect storm of economic paralysis and social unrest. The peasantry was being squeezed for productivity they could no longer provide, while the merchant class had been liquidated and replaced by corrupt officials. The very people Wang Mang claimed to be protecting were the ones suffering most under the weight of his virtuous reforms. The state had become a predatory entity that consumed everything it touched, yet produced nothing but misery and paperwork. The emperor's refusal to acknowledge the market's reality had turned his subjects into a volatile mass of desperate, starving people. The math of the empire no longer added up, and the social contract had been torn to pieces by the imperial ledger. The final liquidation was no longer a question of if, but when. As the internal economy crumbled, the external pressures on the empire began to mount, further straining the already bankrupt treasury. Wang Mang's response to the growing unrest was to double down on his failed policies, believing that more state control was the only way to fix the problems caused by state control. He issued new decrees that further restricted the movement of people and goods, hoping to contain the chaos through sheer force. This only accelerated the collapse, as the remaining productive elements of society were finally strangled by the state's grip. The administrative state was now a terminal patient, kept alive only by the delusions of its creator. The emperor was still auditing the productivity of a dying nation, unaware that the market was about to issue its final, violent correction. The ledger was about to be closed with the blood of the very man who had tried to rewrite it. The total destruction of the price signal had left the empire without a way to value the very lives of its citizens. In the eyes of the state, a human being was nothing more than a unit of labor to be exploited until their utility was exhausted. This dehumanization was the logical conclusion of a system that viewed the economy as a machine and the people as its replaceable parts. The laziness tax had stripped away the dignity of work, while the 5 equalizations had stripped away the freedom of the market. The empire was a hollow shell, filled with gold that could not be spent and grain that could not be eaten. Wang Mang's forensic audit of civilization had reached its final page, and the results were catastrophic. The state had successfully nationalized everything, only to find that it owned nothing but a vast, starving graveyard. The logistics collapse had finally reached the imperial capital, with a shortage of food and fuel was becoming impossible to ignore. Even the palace guards were beginning to feel the effects of the emperor's failed experiments, as their rations were cut to accommodate the state's dwindling reserves. Wang Mang continued to issue complex edicts on the proper way to conduct rituals, even as the reports of rebellion began to flood in from every corner of the empire. He was a man who believed that the world would conform to his vision if he simply wrote the right laws. But the laws of economics were proving to be far more powerful than the laws of an emperor. The market was preparing to reassert itself in the most brutal way possible, through a total and violent liquidation of the Han Dynasty. The first ripples of the Red Eyebrows Rebellion were already turning the Yellow River into a literal sea of blood, and the emperor was about to discover that a state-mandated price on a human life is zero when the currency is already dead. Wang Mang had successfully nationalized the empire's assets, but in doing so, he had also nationalized the empire's risks. In a free market, a natural disaster is a localized shock. In a command economy, it is a terminal system failure. When the Yellow River finally broke its banks, the emperor realized that his bureaucratic machine had no software to handle a crisis it could not predict. The total centralization of power had created a single point of failure that was about to trigger the most violent market correction in human history. By removing the ability of local communities to manage their own grain reserves, the state had effectively insured the entire population against a catastrophe it had no capacity to pay for. This was the ultimate systemic risk, where a single environmental variable could bankrupt the entire imperial enterprise. The Yellow River did not just flood, it underwent a catastrophic course change that displaced millions of people and destroyed the very foundation of the state as tax base. In a functional economy, the price signal would have spiked, drawing grain from distant provinces toward the disaster zone as merchants chased the high margins of survival. However, because Wang Mang had outlawed private trade and fixed the price of grain at a stagnant, imperial rate, there was no incentive for anyone to move resources to the starving north. The state-controlled logistics network was paralyzed by its own administrative friction and a lack of real-time data. Bureaucrats in the capital were still debating the proper ritualistic response, while entire counties were being erased from the map. The nationalization of the soil meant that the farmers had no equity to borrow against and no surplus to fall back on. The emperor had promised a safety net, but he had actually built a cage that trapped the population in a path of inevitable destruction. The Red Eyebrows Rebellion was not a traditional political movement with a coherent ideology. It was a violent reversion to the mean for an economy that had been pushed too far into the red. These rebels, who painted their foreheads to signify their commitment to the struggle, were the physical manifestation of a massive debt that the state could no longer service. They were the displaced, the dispossessed, and the victims of the productivity audits who had finally realized that the status authority was a paper tiger backed by worthless shells. As they marched toward the capital, they did not just burn palaces. They systematically destroyed the census records and the tax ledgers that had been used to track their labor. This was a grassroots liquidation of the administrative state, a forceful attempt to delete the data that had enslaved them. The rebellion was the market-esque way of clearing out the bad debt of the Han Dynasty through a scorched earth policy of total social upheaval. The emperor watched from his high walls as the very people he had tried to optimize began to dismantle the machinery of his civilization. The logistics of starvation were exacerbated by the fact that the emperor had replaced a functioning merchant class with a hierarchy of terrified, incompetent officials. These bureaucrats were more concerned with avoiding an imperial audit than with the actual distribution of food to the dying masses. Grain that had been nationalized and stored in state granaries remained under lock and key because the local managers lacked the specific administrative clearance to release it during an emergency. In many cases, the paperwork required to authorize a shipment of rice took longer to process than it took for a village to starve to death. This was the ultimate asymmetric information trap, where the people with the food had no data and the people with the data had no food. The destruction of the price signal had left the empire blind, deaf, and unable to react to the reality of its own disintegration. Even as the rebels breached the outer provinces, the emperor was still issuing decrees on the proper weight of spade-shaped coins. As the rebellion closed in on the capital of Chang, and the Han Dynasty was facing a sovereign default of unprecedented proportions. The imperial treasury was overflowing with gold that had no purchasing power and tortoise shells that no merchant would accept in exchange for iron or horses. Wang Mang tried to buy the loyalty of his remaining troops with these debased tokens, but the soldiers realized that the state's credit had reached zero. Desertion rates skyrocketed as the realization set in that the emperor was a CEO of a bankrupt monopoly with no assets left to liquidate. The social contract, which had been rewritten as a one-sided ledger of imperial demands, was now being torn up by a population that had nothing left to lose. The state's monopoly on violence, the last pillar of its authority, was crumbling as the soldiers joined the very mobs they were supposed to suppress. The capital was no longer a seat of power, but a concentrated point of failure waiting for its final margin call. The fall of Chang was the ultimate margin call for an empire that had been living on borrowed time and fabricated data. When the rebel forces finally breached the city walls, they did not find a formidable military defense, but a hollowed-out shell of a civilization. The streets were filled with the remnants of the emperor's complex currency experiments, literal piles of copper and shells that were now worth less than the dirt they sat upon. Wang Mang retreated to the Terrace of the End, a symbolic structure where he attempted to use ancient rituals to ward off the inevitable market correction. He clutched his ceremonial robes and recited the classics, still believing that the universe owed him a profit for his supposed virtue. But the mob was not interested in Confucian ethics. They were interested in the physical liquidation of the man who had deleted their livelihoods. The palace, once the center of a total command economy, was now the site of its final, chaotic audit. The death of Wang Mang was not a quick execution, but a physical audit of his failure conducted by a mob that had been stripped of everything. He was cornered in a tower and literally torn to pieces, his body divided among the attackers, as if they were claiming the final dividends of a failed corporation. His head was taken as a trophy, but the rest of him was scattered, a symbolic end to a man who had tried to centralize the entire world into his own hands. This was the ultimate asset erasure, where the architect of a system was himself deleted by the very forces he tried to control. The destruction of his physical form mirrored the destruction of the Han Dynasty, which vanished almost instantly after his death. The state had owned everything, yet in the end, it could not even protect the life of its own CEO. The ledger was finally closed, but the cost of the audit was the lives of millions and the total ruin of the economy. In the aftermath of the Han Dynasty's collapse, the restored Han authorities had to face the reality of a nation that had been economically lobotomized. The well-field land system was abandoned, the complex currencies were scrapped, and the state monopolies were partially dismantled to allow the market to breathe again. However, the damage to the empire's internal credit and its social fabric took generations to repair. The forensic takeaway from this era is that a state can nationalize every asset, control every price, and audit every hour of labor, yet still produce nothing but a total bankruptcy of the spirit and the treasury. Wang Mang's experiment proved that the administrative state is a poor substitute for the decentralized intelligence of a functioning market. He tried to replace the invisible hand with the visible fist, only to find that the fist eventually crushes the very thing it tries to hold. The ruins of his capital stood as a warning to all future central planners that the laws of supply and demand are not suggestions. The story of the socialist emperor is a haunting reminder that economic reality is not a variable that can be manipulated by imperial decree. Wang Mang believed that he could optimize a civilization through the sheer force of his will and the precision of his bureaucratic machine. He ignored the opportunity costs, the administrative friction, and the vital role of the price signal in favor of a theoretical utopia that existed only on his ledgers. This was a forensic audit of a civilization that chose total control over total prosperity, and the result was a systemic collapse that nearly ended Chinese civilization. Modern economies often flirt with the same ideas of centralized risk and state-mandated productivity, forgetting the lesson of the Han Dynasty. The physics of the market are absolute, and any attempt to legislate them out of existence will only result in a more violent reversion to the mean. The ledger of history is written in the blood of those who thought they could outsmart the math of human nature. Ultimately, the Han Dynasty serves as a terminal case study in the dangers of risk nationalization and the hubris of the total command economy. Wang Mang's failure was not due to a lack of resources or a lack of power, but a lack of humility in the face of economic complexity. He treated his subjects as data points and his empire as a factory, failing to realize that an economy is a living ecosystem that requires freedom to thrive. When the state becomes the sole owner of all risk and all reward, it becomes the sole cause of all failure. The market correction that ended his reign was not a tragedy, but a necessary liquidation of a system that had become a parasite on its own people. The invisible hand may be slow, but its grip is firm and its judgment is final. The market always collects its debts.